Hi, my name is Naomi Shin, and I'm going to talk to you about my article called Structured Variation in Child Heritage Speakers' Grammars, which is published in the journal called Language and Linguistics Compass. The article is available for free on the journal's website, Language and Linguistics Compass. The term child heritage speaker generally refers to a child learning a minority language in the home. So for example, if you speak Korean at home and English outside the home, we might say that you're a heritage speaker of Korean, right? The Korean is your heritage language. Unfortunately, child heritage speakers' grammars are sometimes analyzed as being deficient or unsystematic. And this is what we call the deficit view of bilingualism. Now, the deficit view of child heritage speakers' grammars can be very harmful. It can lead to children being told that the way they talk is wrong, which in turn can lead to linguistic insecurity and sometimes even an unwillingness to speak the heritage language. All of this affects academic performance and even socio-emotional well-being. In this paper, I argue that studying structured variation, so using a variationist approach, we sometimes call this. So studying structured variation can help affirm and celebrate the richness of child heritage speakers' developing grammars. So what do we mean by structured variation? Well, the term structured is very important here because it is important to note that the variation we're talking about is not random. When we talk about structured variation in language, we're referring to the interchange of linguistic forms where the choice to use one form over the other is probabilistically conditioned by linguistic and social factors. I'm going to illustrate with an example. Consider Spanish subject pronoun use. In this example, the speaker said, "Primero vino aquí mi hermano, y luego yo, porque yo nací hasta el último. Tengo dos hermanos." So in English, this means first my brother came here, and later I, because I was born last, I have two brothers. I want to draw your attention to the usage of the subject pronoun yo, which means I. Yo nací, I was born. And then notice that the next time the speaker refers to themselves and says I, in Spanish, the speaker does not include yo. They just say tengo. So this is similar to saying I was born last, have two brothers, instead of I have two brothers. Importantly, this variation between expressing the subject pronoun, in this case yo, and omitting the subject pronoun is not random. Instead, multiple factors probabilistically condition usage. So for example, singular subject pronouns are expressed more than plural ones, the tense, mood, and aspect of the verb conditions usage, and whether or not the speaker keeps talking about the same referent or switches it conditions usage. So for example, in this example 1, the speaker keeps talking about themselves, so I. So that's maintaining reference across two clauses, as opposed to, say, switching, because I was born last, he has, for example. That would be switching reference. And switching reference increases the likelihood of expressing the pronoun, okay? Now, why does this even matter for research on language development? Well, variation is sometimes misunderstood, and then usage is misanalyzed as a sign of not having learned a particular part of grammar. Going back to our example of yo nací and tengo, sometimes people have argued or assumed that you have to actually omit the subject pronoun when you refer to the same person across clauses. So yo nací tengo, it's been asserted that you have to omit yo here, and that you can't say yo nací hasta el último, yo tengo dos hermanos, that you can't say yo across two clauses, right? So that has been argued in the literature that would be repetitive for Spanish speakers, and that Spanish speakers would find that redundant. Okay. Now it turns out that actually empirical studies show that actually short Spanish speakers across Spanish speaking communities sometimes do repeat yo across clauses, right? So there's no rule banning this. Instead, it's part of the variation, the structured variation of Spanish, but there's nothing wrong with repeating the yo across clauses. Now, this is important because if you misunderstand variation, if you actually think there's a rule prohibiting the, or that it sounds redundant or that it's somehow wrong to express the pronoun across two clauses, that can lead to an overestimation of difference between heritage speakers and other speakers. Why? Because if you assume that all other speakers won't repeat the pronoun, and then you see the heritage speakers are repeating the pronoun, then you think, oh, well, the heritage speakers are different because they have these redundant pronouns. But unfortunately, what you've done, what you might be doing in that case, is you might be overestimating the difference. So it turns out that other speakers repeat pronouns too, okay? So in the paper, I review variation studies that actually reveal similarities where between heritage and monolingual Spanish-speaking children, in particular, similarities where differences have often been assumed. And I refer to research on differential object marking in Spanish, variable clitic placement in Spanish, and subject-pronoun expression in Spanish. Now, a second point I make in the paper is that variation is not the same as unsystematic. So learners may actually show variation where others do not, but that doesn't mean their variation is unsystematic. Their variation may very well be systematic and complex, even if it's different, even if their variation is different from what you would see in their parents, for example, or in monolingual speakers, for example, it still may be systematic and complex. Let me give you an example from Spanish again. And in this case, we're going to talk about gender agreement. Okay? So in this sentence, Eva no encuentra su teléfono y lo necesita para llamarte. Okay? This means Eva can't find her phone and she needs it to call you. Now, in general, in most varieties of Spanish, what you would expect here is Eva no encuentra su teléfono y lo necesita, where lo meaning it, she needs it to call you. It is lo, and that's masculine, and it's referring back to teléfono, which is a masculine noun. Okay, so you expect it to refer back to teléfono since there's gender agreement between the direct object clitic lo and the direct object referred to teléfono, you expect lo, right? Okay. And indeed, most that's what you get in across varieties of Spanish, right? Most of the time. Okay, but what if a heritage speaker says, Eva no encuentra su teléfono y la necesita para llamarte? In this case, in this example with the blue la, what you're getting is a feminine direct object pronoun, right? Or feminine direct object clitic. Now, how do we analyze this? So the feminine la is not agreeing with the direct object. Again, this is Eva can't find her phone and she needs it to call you. So there's a mismatch in agreement between la and the direct object teléfono, because teléfono is masculine and la is feminine. How do you analyze this? Well, one way to analyze this is just to simply say, well, the child struggles with gender agreement. They haven't learned gender agreement, and stop there. But that could promote a deficit view of the child's developing grammar, right? Because you have to study what they're actually doing. So another approach could be, well, maybe the child has actually constructed a different grammar, but maybe that grammar is complex. Well, indeed, what we found in one of our studies, we did find examples of children producing la instead of lo to refer back to a masculine noun. But it turned out that the child was consistently doing that, and they were using la not to, they were making la agree in gender with the subject. So they were doing this when the subject was feminine. So Ava can't find her phone and she needs it to call you. Instead of making the gender of the direct object clitic agree with the direct object referent, they were making the gender of the direct object clitic agree with the subject. Now that is very different. We did not find that among our monolingual speakers. We did not find that among, we didn't find it in non-heritage speaker grammars in this study. So it's different, but it's still highly systematic and very complex if you think about it, right? It requires matching the gender of the direct object clitic to the subject. Okay, so I review some variationist studies that show difference between child heritage speakers of Spanish and other speakers, but these studies show differences, but they also show systematic grammatical patterns. And we find this in studies of direct object gender agreement, as well as direct object omission. So to summarize, the article stresses the importance of the variationist approach, or the studying structured variation, and the importance of this for research on child heritage speakers' grammars. And I argue that this can help us avoid overestimating differences between heritage speakers and other types of speakers. And it also can help us to avoid underestimating grammatical systematicity in the developing grammars of these speakers. And in some variationist approaches, that is, studying structured variation, can thus help affirm and celebrate the richness of child heritage speakers' developing grammars. Thank you.